Open my lips.
and my mouth will declare your praise. What if? What if? Two of the hardest, most difficult to pin down, least simple words in the English language, words that open up a Pandora's box of alternative universes, some in which the very worst does not happen or did not have to happen, but also sometimes where the very best also does not happen. Or maybe the very best does happen, but then is cruelly, prematurely taken away from us. And these what if scenarios, these questions that we may ask ourselves, they can be as true to us on a personal level, on a familial level, just as they are in this story of Josiah's demise on a national level, on a collective level. For me, a Disciples of Christ pastor is at the heart of one such moment of a nation asking, what if? Because he was briefly president of the United States. James A. Garfield, probably most famous for a last name that he shares with a certain cat, was a Disciples of Christ pastor by training, but he eventually began a political career in Ohio that culminated in him gaining the Republican nomination for president in 1880. The current Republican president back then, Rutherford Hayes, was so disliked he did not even attempt to run for re-election, much less renomination. James Garfield, on the other hand, compared to Hayes, Hayes was disliked because of how he came to power with that 1876 compromise that made Republicans dislike him because it ended Reconstruction and made Democrats dislike him because it took the presidency from their nominee, Samuel Tilden. Garfield, on the other hand, was thoroughly incorruptible. He represented a shift from the sort of less than above board dealings of the previous Grant and Hayes administrations. He was committed to civil rights, to government reform, to honesty in our leadership. But only a few months into his presidency, he was shot by a resentful ex-follower who felt wrongly that Garfield owed him a patronage appointment to the government. So that's the first what if moment for this Disciples pastor turned president of the United States. What if he hadn't been shot by this disgruntled follower? But the second what if comes afterwards in his treatment. Back in 1881, germ theory was in its infancy, and Garfield's doctors were not unanimous as to its veracity. Garfield very likely died not because of the wounds from the bullet, but because of the lack of hygiene by his doctors that led to infection and illness that did eventually slowly and probably very painfully killed him. So that's the second what if. And then the third what if for this Disciples pastor turned president comes after his death. His running mate, Chester Alan Arthur, as vice president, becomes president, but he does not possess Garfield's moral and intellectual compass. Arthur was a machine politician, and he was not so committed as Garfield was to reform and civil rights. He signed into law pieces of legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which essentially banned Chinese immigrants from the United States solely because they were Chinese. And knowing what I know about Garfield and his faith and his worldview, I cannot see him signing such a bill into law. I can only see him vetoing it. So that's the third what if. What if Garfield had been more successful than either his predecessor, Rutherford Hayes, in binding up the country's wounds? And what if he had been more successful than his successor, Chester Alan Arthur, in protecting the rights of others? And that's at the core of the what if question that is presented by the death of Josiah. We know that Josiah was more effective than his successors, his sons. We know that he was more faithful than his predecessors, his father and his grandfather. And we know from the prophetess Huldah that it is Josiah's faith that kept Judah, the kingdom of Judah, in covenant, in right relationship with God. So what if he hadn't been killed at Megiddo? And it's that question that we return to this story of Josiah with, and we end this story of Josiah with. Josiah is remembered as the last righteous king of either Israel or Judah, with Judah being that southern kingdom centered around Jerusalem after the unified kingdom of David and Solomon is split in two. Josiah is remembered not just as a righteous king, but having been a very young king, being crowned at just 8 years of age, and in the 18th year of his reign, instituting these sweeping religious reforms that bring Judah back into its covenant with God. And this stood in marked contrast with the behavior that the writer of 2 Kings is keen to note, even in the death of Josiah, the behavior of Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, who had reigned as king for 55 years. Manasseh had reversed the pro-Yahweh reforms of his own father, Hezekiah. Hezekiah had been faithful to God. Manasseh undid all of that, as did his son, Josiah's father, Amon. And this quest by Josiah to sort of undo Manasseh's 55 years of unfaithfulness began with the story 2 weeks ago with the discovery of a scroll or a book. It's likely a Torah scroll or a fragment of a scroll in the temple to God in Jerusalem. And it's presented straight away to Josiah because likely all of the scrolls were thought to be extinct, that Manasseh, as part of his unfaithfulness, had had them burned. Josiah orders the scroll taken to a prophetess of some renown, Huldah. And it's her story that we read about last week. He brings it to Huldah so that Huldah can authenticate the scroll as the genuine article. And we had to, for the sake of time in the sermon series, skip over the narrative of the reforms themselves, but we arrive today at the final reform, the final religious reform that Josiah implements, which is the reinstitution of the Passover meal. And then we hear of his subsequent death in battle at the hands of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho. Josiah has both spiritually and politically represented a holistic good for the kingdom of Judah. Spiritually, he has reinvigorated the people's relationship with God, brought them back into right relationship with their Creator. And politically, he has now, for several decades, as king, navigated Judah, which was this very, very small kingdom. He has navigated this small kingdom through sort of very treacherous diplomatic waters that come from having two sort of very expansionist, violent superpowers on either side of you. Egypt to one side, and Assyria followed by Babylon on the other side. Imagine Judah sort of as this poor, unwilling rope in this tug of war between these superpowers that it finds itself sandwiched by. Necho, the Egyptian pharaoh, is in some ways a mirror image of Josiah. Necho is a young pharaoh who has just begun his own reign. When he invades the Middle East, he has been pharaoh for only about a year. He's likely eager to flex his muscles, so he begins this military campaign against Assyria or Babylon. The quickest way through to the Euphrates. So if you look at a map, the quickest way from the Sinai Peninsula through to the Euphrates is through Judah. through modern day Israel. Josiah's decision to give fight to Necho may have been in the service of the interests for the Assyrians or the Babylonians, that he is sort of acting as a buffer for them, but only so far as the sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of logic takes us. Necho represented the immediate existential threat to Judah, not Babylon. That comes 20 years later under Nebuchadnezzar. In the immediate moment, the immediate threat is represented by Egypt. And so Josiah intercepting the Egyptian pharaoh at Megiddo, it may have served other interests. It may have been for the benefit of Assyria or for Babylon, but it was chiefly for the benefit of Judah because its independence was immediately threatened. It was an act of self-defense. And Josiah is killed at Megiddo, and a little more than 20 years after his death, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, will invade Judah. He will sack Jerusalem, and in keeping in line with Babylonian imperial policy, he will take with him back into Babylon, back into exile, the ruling class of Jerusalem in order to leave the remaining Israelites decapitated, to leave them basically without a functioning government. But what that does, what Nebuchadnezzar does, is it codifies what rapidly becomes a reality after the death of Josiah. Because as soon as Josiah dies, Judah's government stops functioning. It becomes dysfunctional. As Ted noted, Josiah's son Jehoahaz is crowned king, and Jehoahaz, like Josiah, resists Necho, but he does so ineffectively, or sort of so with the lack of skill that Josiah does, that within months, Necho captures him and imprisons him. And Jehoahaz never sees Jerusalem again. He dies in exile in Egypt. So after Jehoahaz becomes basically a series of puppet kings for Judah, Judah from this point on is ruled by kings installed by foreign governments. First by Egypt. Jehoiakim is installed by the prophet Necho. When Jehoiakim dies, Nebuchadnezzar after Jehoiakim dies, Nebuchadnezzar sees what happens, has Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah eventually crowned king. And then after Zedekiah outlives his usefulness, that's when Nebuchadnezzar invades Judah. All of this takes place in the span of just 20 years. So imagine from 2001 to now, going from living in an independent state ruled by a righteous and godly king to having your home burned to the ground by the invading Babylonians. That is a huge existential shift to have to undergo in such a short amount of time. Because this ends a 400-year-old dynasty. The line of kings in Jerusalem can trace itself all the way back to David. So what if Josiah didn't fall in battle? Huldah the prophetess says that God would not let Judah fall so long as Josiah was king. What if Josiah had survived? What if Josiah had more time to prepare his sons Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim to be righteous and to be godly? What if? What if? Now, I said at the beginning of this message that this question is just as applicable to our personal lives, to our familial, individual lives, as it is to our collective lives as a people, as a church, as a nation. Because it's a question that we so easily feel over any number of decisions, any number of events that we may experience in our lives. Sometimes it manifests itself as sort of a form of buyer's remorse. What if I had bought this car instead of this one? This nice car instead of the lemon I have? Or what if I had bought that house instead of this one? Other times, the what if is relational in nature. What if I had not said this thing to a loved one that hurt them, that harmed our relationship? Or what if I had stood up and said something when someone said something offensive that hurt someone else? What if I had stood up and done the right thing? And other times that feeling is spiritual in nature. What if my faith in God were stronger, were deeper, less shakable? What if I had spent more time devoted to that relationship I have with my Creator? What if? What if? What if? Now, maybe these feelings don't entirely go away for us. Maybe they sort of always are present on some back burner, no matter how low the heat is turned. I think we can still minimize those feelings, those questions, by owning completely what we can take control of, or at least can control our small piece of, that we take full ownership of that. We can say to ourselves, no, by ourselves, we don't control the outcome of an election or the economy or even a sports game, like a certain Super Bowl that may have happened recently. But we can control our small part in contributing to it, whether it's as a voter, as a citizen, as a fan. We control our ability to contribute our small part to it. And when we do not abdicate that part, when we own it, when we take charge of it, I do think it can offer us some reassurance if we know that we have left it all out on the proverbial field. Knowing Josiah's zealousness, the way we have gotten to know him these past 3 weeks, I have to think that he probably left it all out on the battlefield at Megiddo. I feel confident that he would have done everything he could for his kingdom until he couldn't, because God gave him that strength. God gives us that strength too, to do all we can until we can't anymore. And our full devotion, that full commitment to God ought to mitigate that feeling. Again, maybe not erase it entirely, but to lessen the feeling of all the what ifs. And even if they don't go away entirely, there may yet be a reason for that, because the what if, the asking what could have happened, what might have happened, the acknowledgement that so many things could happen, but that only one actually will, of all the possibilities that we are faced with. What if? Now, this is my what if question. What if our acknowledgement of all those possibilities is a form of mourning? Of mourning what could have been, but never will be. And so maybe those questions stay with us because mourning is eternal. It's ongoing. And asking what if can be a very particular form of mourning, because we're mourning that which never existed but had the hope of existing. And so by asking this question, we are mourning the ethereal, the hypothetical, the possible. Stuff that is real in our heads, even if it's not always real in the world. And so we live in this tension of both mourning and striving. Maybe of mourning what could be but won't be, but also striving to leave everything we can out there, to keep going until we can't. I think that is what Josiah lived. He mourned, he tore his clothes, he lamented, he grieved the failures of his father and his grandfather, but he spent the rest of his reign leaving it all out there, going forward and ruling righteously until he couldn't. And I think because of that, Josiah, despite the fate that would befall his kingdom, I think he dies at peace. The mourning for his kingdom, the mourning of what might be possible, continues. But amid that, we can exist in the peace of knowing that we do everything we can until we can't. If we strive that hard, if we push that hard to grow in faith, to grow in love and in kindness and in compassion, then we can say we are at peace. But that takes the work of striving until we can't. And because of that, it is a peace that is so enviable. A peace that I think so many of us search for, but too few of us ever find. May it come to you as surely as it came to an 8-year-old king who ruled his kingdom out of a fierce love of God and a fierce love for God's people. May it be so.